Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, way-worn wanderer bore to his own native shore. Greetings, Poe fans, and welcome back to one of our degree episodes. And Jeanie, what are we talking about this evening?
We are going to the aristocracy. We are going to talk about the wonderful Lord Byron and
Yes,
how his influence and how he's actually kind of creepily um, so similar to Poe.
yes, and we're kind of going away from Poe's influences to an influence on Poe,
Yeah, exactly.
which is kind
Because,
of cool.
yeah, because, we always talk about how Poe has influenced, the writers and poets and even pop culture. But now we're going to discuss how some, especially Lord Byron,
Hmm.
get some influence onto Poe and similarities between his writing, his life, even that he shared with Poe.
Absolutely. So Lord Byron was living during part of the time that Poe was alive. So that would have been very cool had Lord Byron been able to come to America. But Poe
Hmm.
technically went to England during some of the time that Lord Byron was over there. So it would have been really cool if they had gotten to meet. But um, let's give a little background about Lord Byron. As we should say, George Gordon Noel Byron. So
Yes, because
he
that was
was,
his official name.
yes. And do you know, I did not know his full name until we started doing research for this. So I thought that was very interesting.
Well, and that's the thing. Most people don't ever refer to him as his
Oh,
full name because he, and I guess it has a lot to do because back in that time period, royalty, especially when in the lords and ladyships, they always referred to them mostly by their names. They never actually had their real names because even most in today's royalty, they go by previous
yeah,
royalty, like with popes.
that's
The
true.
popes,
That
that's
is so
not their
true.
real name. They
Choose a
what they
name.
call, yeah, thank you.
Hmm.
So I guess that's why Lord Byron, when he became, when he took over as Lord Byron for the lordship,
Right.
that's just how everybody referred to him.
Yeah, it's almost kind of like his notoriety, and we'll discuss more of this later in the episode.
Hmm.
But when you think about people today with just the fanfare of having one name that people know by, like Elvis or Cher or something like that,
A prince, or
yeah, he was Byron. So
exactly.
it's just very interesting. But
Hmm.
yes, but old George
Yeah.
was born January 22nd, 1788. And Jeannie and I were talking about this before we went live, or not live, but recorded live with you guys. That very interesting how close his birthday is to Poe's of January 19th.
Yeah, and 21 years apart. So
Yeah, exactly. And
yeah, 3 days apart and 21 years apart. So
yeah,
it's kind of they're in the same era.
yeah.
So
Oh, absolutely. And then he died on April 19th, 1824. So let's see, Poe would have been, let's see, 13. Yeah,
1824,
let's see, hold on, 4,
18.
9, 15, 15.
Yeah, he was 15.
Yeah. So a teenage Poe.
Yeah, and I mean, it kind of makes sense that he would have gotten a lot of influence because, he was influenced by Charles Dickens, who
Mhm.
was also an English author,
Right.
whereas Lord Byron is also an English poet. So,
Absolutely. And with, his formative years of education, his early, there's a term I'm looking for, when your elementary years, or there's another, name for it, but anyway,
Primary.
yeah, primary. Thank you.
You're
Uh,
welcome.
uh, he was in England, so he definitely would have been reading this stuff.
Exactly. And the fun thing is about, well, one thing is that Lord Byron became Lord Byron when he was only 10 years old.
I know. I that was really wild.
And, that has to have a lot of influence on a person's life.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, not that I know anything about royalty, because I'm from the hills of East Tennessee. We didn't have much royalty. Uh, but that's the thing. I mean, and Poe, Poe, think about it. If his mother had lived, he
Yeah.
would have grown up in the theater.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that would have had a different impact on him. But in actuality, he was adopted into a aristocratic family. I mean,
Yeah.
let's just go ahead and say it because uh, Alan was what he was corporate America before corporate America. So,
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
and he had influences and stuff. So there's that similarity there between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
They were being groomed, if you
Yeah.
will, for certain things of life or certain ways of life.
Yeah.
And so, but I
English
can't,
gentleman, a Virginia gentleman, I guess you could say.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of similarities. I mean, if you think about it, in the New World during that time in the early 1800s,
Mm-hmm.
that, America had only been America for just, in its infancy.
Absolutely.
So there was still a little bit of the aristocrat uh, and a little bit of that nobility still hanging around, sort of thing,
Yeah, I would
with the
definitely agree with
social
you.
statures. Yeah.
Mhm. Definitely so.
Yeah. So I think that was an influence they both had pounded into them.
Yeah, in common, definitely. Well,
Hmm.
he was a major figure in the Romantic period, and if not the major, you know, player in the Romantic period
Hmm.
because of how much he wrote, the styles of poetry that he wrote, and he was a true poet. He dabbled in, pretty much almost everything, satire, of all different types of verse. Let's see, odes, lyrics, dramas, tragedies, you name it. One of the main things that he used it was like almost his signature was the heroic couplet, and he
Hmm.
used neoclassicism. And I think a lot of and basically neoclassicism was kind of the epitome of the Romantic period or of Romanticism in general. And I think that, he obviously had classical studies just like Poe. And in a lot of Poe's, especially early works, you get that Greco-Roman style.
Yeah, and I mean, you could even play this into that their education starts showing,
It does. Yeah.
where they are both given very high-end educations
Mm-hmm.
and getting exposed. Huh, no pun intended. Getting exposed to different ways of life in their early days in boarding schools, because
Mm-hmm.
Poe went to boarding schools during the early years when he was living in London.
Yeah.
And then you had Byron, of course, being an aristocratic. He had all these wonderful schools that he attended
Mm-hmm.
in his early years.
Yep.
And one of the most interesting things is that the crossover that we both discussed about is their love for female cousins that inspired certain works.
That yes, very, very much
And
so.
yeah, because Byron was 12 when an ebullition of passion was actually fraught upon because of his cousin Margaret Parker,
Mm-hmm.
and it inspired his first dash into poetry.
Yes.
So, and that kind of doesn't doesn't it's not as shocking as if you look into history as most people think it would be, because in royalties they would not cross bloodlines because they wanted to keep it pure, and that's why
Right. Oh, yes.
certain, even kings, uh like King Tut, they have made mention that maybe that's one of the reasons why he died so young, because he was suffering from a lot of maladies because of the crossed, but the bloodlines being just one
too
single
pure.
tree, no
Yeah.
branching. Yeah.
Yeah. And I always, I can remember when I was teaching history, the Habsburgs, and that's all you need to
Oh,
say.
yes,
Well,
exactly.
and kind of also kind of thinking about that you bring that up, Jeannie. Well, he was born in London, but when he was born with a club foot on his
Hmm.
right foot. So that could have been a birth defect due to the line being too pure. It's very possible.
Exactly. There's all kinds of speculations, especially when you trace back some of the royal lines and
Hmm.
all that, and so it's just a speculation, but it's just something that I thought was more ironic that Byron and Poe had in common.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And another thing that they had in common was that both at the age of 3, their fathers were not in the picture anymore.
Hmm.
And Byron, pretty much, his father squandered his mother's inheritance and pretty much ran up all this debt. He ran off, and then creditors were looking for him. And then he died in 1791. And so
Yeah, and he was
he had that,
36 years old.
yeah, and which Byron, like you said earlier,
Hmm.
was 36 when he died. It's just
Yep.
eerie.
It is. It's like, well, but if you look at Byron's history, his didn't have anything to do, I think, with squandering or with with running away from other people. His was because he was a free love.
Yes.
He was all about the love, and he was very much, and that's one thing that I think is the difference between him and Poe. And we even discussed this because I was even looking, if you even look at their pictures, if you look at it, that Byron had more of a playboy look of that day, more of
Yeah.
that royal, more of that he was all about getting getting the other, getting the attention, I guess I could say.
Yes.
Whereas Poe was very enamored, but only with certain people. He
Yes.
was very much centered on just specifics, not generalizations, where Byron was like, woohoo, let's go
He,
party.
well, and he kind of put the romance in romantic period and
Yeah. They put a
leave it right
romance
there.
and everything. Yes, exactly.
Oh my goodness.
Which brings actually one of his first works that he published, they made him go back and
Yes.
redo it because there was too much eroticism in the work,
Yes.
in the poems and everything he wrote. And they're like,
Yeah.
no, we're not publishing that. It's too erotic.
Yeah, and that was in 1806. It was actually his first book of poetry called Fugitive Pieces.
Exactly.
And it wasn't the last time, it was the first time he was censored,
Yeah.
but especially Don Juan had to be like edited, but then when he wrote more of it, he finally said, "No, this is my
Yep.
work. We're not doing that. We're not cutting, we're not slashing. It stays as is." And the reviews came back uh just with debauchery and just all
Hmm.
kinds of horrible things because it
Yeah,
was,
he was very much free with what he wrote and how he wrote it. He did not want to be censored. He did not want to be told that, you can't write that. And it's like, but that's the way it is. That's the way I want it to be, brought to the audience.
yeah, exactly. Well, and something else that I think probably also tied into some of his writing was he grew up, he loved reading the Bible. He
Hmm.
was a believer in Calvinism, especially the belief of predestination, and he loved history. And you can definitely see that in a lot of the things that he wrote about. And there's what's called that he kind of he it's his staple was the Byronic hero.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it his Presbyterian aunt who helped raise him that would read it? Was it either his nanny or nurse? Was nanny, nurse, or aunt? I can't remember exactly which one, but was Presbyterian and would read him the Bible, and that's where he fell in because he loved her so much.
yeah.
And then he started reading the Bible, and that's when he fell in love with the Bible and all that kind of stuff. So I thought
Hmm.
that was ironic too, because you think of Muddy and Poe,
Absolutely. Yeah.
they had a big influence on, you know, the extended family, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. And I was going to read a little blurb that I pulled out about the Byronic hero. It says
Okay.
that his various heroes exhibit not uniformity, but considerable diversity. Among their traits are romantic melancholy, guilt for secret sin, pride, defiance, restlessness, alienation, revenge, remorse, moodiness, and such noble virtues as honor, altruism, courage, and pure love for a gentle woman.
Mm-hmm.
What does that kind of sound like? A lot of those terms.
Deadpool. No, I'm just teasing.
Okay. I don't know where that came from, but okay.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, when you were reading it, I was like, oh, we're describing, but no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, a lot of those same traits are what Poe wrote about. I mean, think
Hmm.
about it. Melancholy, alienation, revenge, remorse. I mean, and then the pure love for a gentle woman. I mean, guilt,
Hmm.
all of these things. And so, again, you can see how Poe emulated some of what he learned from Byron into his own works with that.
Yeah, the Byronic hero was like one of the staples that you can think about when you look in the early, back, way back in the Iliad, and
Yeah,
with the Odyssey, and with all the tragedies, but the heroes that have built from the Greeks up through there. And so Byron just took it and he created his own Byronic hero, and then
absolutely.
Poe took his influence from that
Yep.
and created his own. But the one thing that I love about Poe is that he took those Byronic descriptors for the hero,
Hmm.
and when he writes them, you don't know which one the Byron hero is, because
Right.
what comes to mind for me once more is the Cask of Amontillado
Yeah.
with Fortunato and Montague.
Montresor.
Yeah.
Montresor.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Shakespeare popped in there for some reason. I don't know why, but it just
It's all
wrong,
good.
wrong him. But yeah, I mean, think about it. The Byronic hero, that could apply to either one of them,
Yeah.
except for the altruism, because neither one of, they were both out for, somebody going to die. But
Yeah.
but the melancholy, all that kind of stuff. And
Exactly. But in Poe's works, is it more of a hero or is it an anti-hero? And I think, Jeannie, with what you said about
mhm.
Montresor and Fortunato, you can kind of look at it that way every time you read it. The Cask of
Yeah, and I
Amontillado.
think that's
Yeah.
where Poe adapted his own interpretation of Byron's hero,
Yeah.
to where he created the anti-hero
Mm-hmm.
in the works, but at the same time he did keep that underlying heroic parts,
Yeah.
but he also added in there the other side to the story, so to speak.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. Well, Byron's first major work was in March of 1809. It was published called English Bards and Scotch Reviews. And he published it as anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically a satire where he is kind of against several critics and poets by the name of Scott, Southey, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's why he published it anonymously, because even though he wanted to shout out about some of the things they were writing about and he did not agree with them, but he wanted to do it in a way that he could get away with it, because again, that's his first major work. And if you're going
Yeah.
to take these people down who have been writing for a while and this is your first work, are you going to shoot yourself in the foot by doing that?
Yeah, I mean, and because he was still young, he was
Yeah.
only 21.
Yeah.
And I think what the irony of is he wrote this anonymously, and Poe was 3 months old.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's
And
like, oh,
yeah, and I mean, and Poe wrote some things anonymously or as the
hmm
Bostonian and things like that. And he had, different pseudonyms he would use. And so that's kind of another thing that they have in common. And even though Byron was not an official like critic, he did not ever work as a critic, but Poe was. It just Byron, I think you said it really well earlier, Jeannie. What did you say? How his kind of critical review?
well, Byron, and I think this also comes down to where they lived and grew up.
Yeah,
Because if you think about it, him being an aristocrat and him, being in all the different avenues, that his critique of other works was more in a group of society of peers,
yeah,
where he was more immersed with the peers of his own writers,
yeah,
whereas Poe wasn't. Poe was still involved with other writers, but because of the vast area of the United States, they were so spread out that he didn't have his own little grouping. He didn't have his own little clique, if you want to say it,
yeah.
of who he could, be critical with.
Right.
So he
Yeah,
worked in an environment to where that was his job. Whereas Byron, it wasn't so much a job, it's just that he was a royal. He was,
hmm
he could say those things. He
and
could,
get away with it.
yeah, he could get
hmm
away with it because that's, part and parcel of his life.
Absolutely. And a quote I pulled out that he basically said about Don Juan, his Canto
Mhm.
15. He said, "I was born for opposition." And
Yep.
so that totally makes sense based on his being born into the aristocracy.
Yep. And he was a aristocracy at that time period was definitely in turmoil a lot
hmm
because they had just lost the New World, the British
Yeah.
colonies, and
hmm
not everybody was happy with the kings and the queens and the lords and the ladies and all those wonderful peoples. And plus his mother, who was of the aristocracy, and then the uncle, the great uncle he took over for
Yeah.
Byron, the Byron ship
Yeah.
or the Byron legacy or whatever, was known as the Wicked Byron.
Oh, yes. And I actually wrote down that when in 1798, when he did take that over, he became
Mhm.
the sixth Baron Byron of Rockdale. That was the
Yep,
actual official title. I thought that was kind
yep.
of interesting.
Sixth Baron Byron of the Baron Byron. That's a whole different connotation because he wasn't
Absolutely.
Baron.
No, no.
He left his legacy illegitimately along the way.
Oh, yes. Well, and one child in wedlock. So, uh,
Oh, no.
yeah. But about this time in 1809, when he published that work, he was getting the the taste of, I want to see the world. I want to see all these things. And he wanted to travel. Well,
Mhm.
just like his father, he had gotten
Mhm.
himself into debt, but he figured out a way to do this grand tour of the Mediterranean. And so while he went to Greece, Italy, Armenia, I'm trying to think where else he went. He went several places just all along the Mediterranean, but he studied languages that while
Mhm.
he was there, Italian, modern Greek, and he learned Armenian. And so that's another thing he and Poe have in common because Poe was fluent in French
Yeah,
and
they had a
Latin.
knack for the languages.
Yeah. And you kind of wonder, is that something to do with just being a wordsmith or a poet? Just that you kind of wonder, is there something there? There's some kind of tie.
Yeah, and I think that also has a lot to do with the influencers of that time,
Hmm.
with the people and the writers and stuff. Because, if you think about it, America was not as vast,
Yeah,
but yet all the influence was still coming from Europe,
true.
because you had the French influence, which is why I think that French was a big influence on Poe because the French were still many, what do you call them? Oh, I can't think of the word. They were imports. They were, French imports and stuff. So in the
Yeah,
harbors and stuff. So Poe was
yes.
getting a lot of influence from French people, is what I'm trying to
Well,
say.
true. And the French were friendly with
Yeah.
Americans. So,
Yes. And people who are in love with language and love to write, I
hmm,
think they would be influenced a lot by that.
yeah, I
Uh,
agree.
I think that's why Poe fell in love with the French more than the English way of life, and I think that's why he put a lot of his settings in
Yeah,
France.
I agree. Totally.
Yeah, and so you know, Byron would learn this language because he had a lot of, especially Greek. If you look at it in his writing, he pays a lot
Hmm.
of homage to the beauty of
Yeah.
the Greek Renaissance period and all that wonderful idealistic looks of women and even men.
Hmm.
So I think he
That's
was
true.
he was in, influenced by them that way. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree. And then not long after he was, gone for a couple years, August 2nd, 1811, his mother died.
Hmm.
And there was a boy that he was very fond of who also died around the same time. And the boy died of tuberculosis or consumption.
Yeah.
And he did write a poem for that child.
Yeah. He was, and like I said, Byron was all about his love of life
Hmm.
and love of people.
Yeah.
And he really didn't have much of a filter when it came to that.
No. Mm-mm. He, it seemed like in doing research, he did have more, like he had lots of affairs, more affairs
Hmm.
with women, but he did have relationships of some sort with men as well.
Yeah, which wasn't that unusual, especially in
Yeah,
the royalty and aristocrats of those
exactly.
days. So, but he was definitely a lover,
Hmm.
which fits with his romanticism.
Absolutely. And just the way he wrote as well. It all ties together.
Definitely. He did have a wonderful flow of the language and a beauty in itself with his writing.
Yeah, and I think I can't remember if you had mentioned earlier that he did have an affair with his distant cousin,
Yeah.
Augusta, And
No. Augusta is his half sister.
okay, I read that it was his cousin.
Mm-mm. Augusta was his half
Okay.
sister. That was the daughter of his father, who
Okay.
was three, and then yeah, Mary, Mary. Somebody told you
Hmm.
that Mary. Somebody was the cousin.
Okay. Okay.
Augusta is his half sister.
Yeah, and that was in 1813. And so in his writing, he actually tackles subjects of incest, and
Mm-hmm.
he had very liberal politics. And I didn't really see where some of the politics came into his poetry, but I think it probably did a little bit, especially when
Yeah,
he's talking about history.
yeah. I mean, we probably wouldn't have seen it or would see it if we read a lot of it because, the political charges of those days were different. And so
Hmm.
what he may have written could have only been understood or interpreted by the politicians of those days.
Yeah.
Whereas we would just seen it, just somewhat, just taking a jab at somebody. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who cares?
Well, on April 15th, 1814, Augusta had a child. It was a girl named Elizabeth Madera,
Hmm.
and Byron never claimed her as his own child, but speculation was that she probably was his child.
Yeah. Yeah, they speculated that she was his, but he never claimed her and Augusta never said.
Yeah, exactly. And during this time, it was very interesting reading about the women who he was involved with, Augusta being one. There was another lady named Annabella that he really liked, had proposed to. She turned him down, but then he started, having an affair with Augusta. And then Annabella came back. Her parents really wanted her to marry him. And so on January 2nd, 1815, they were married. And
Oh, okay.
I think the marriage kept being postponed for different reasons and all of that. And so it was just very odd.
There's those A names like Annabella. Ooh, that
Exactly.
reminds me a lot of. Oh wait, Annabelle Lee. Okay.
So after all that happened, he got back to writing a little bit before the marriage in 1814, and he was working on Hebrew melodies. And
Mm-hmm.
this is the work that Jeanie is going to be reading part of, the very first part of it at the end of our episode. But it's that famous line, Jeanie, what is it?
Oh, sorry, I, I blanked. Sorry. She walks in beauty like the night.
Yes, and she'll be reading the first stanza little at the end of our episode.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, I've read a lot of Byron over the years,
Hmm.
but the Hebrew melodies
Yeah,
were his most popular works,
yeah,
in my opinion.
yeah,
And I think it's because they just call to you and speak to you, and it is just the perfect epitome of what romanticism truly is, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah. Well, I mean, in that just that line alone by itself, I mean, speaks
Hmm.
just
Yeah,
volumes. I mean, it
I
really
mean,
does.
and it evokes pictures, and it, to me,
Hmm.
it evokes the artistry
Yeah.
of the painters of those times in the olden days, like the Lady of the Lake, and
Yes. Yes.
all those wonderful error paintings that were done, because they just match so perfectly. You could take so many of the poems in the Romantic era and match them with the paintings and the Renaissance painters, that it's like
Hmm.
they were just so in sync with each other.
Oh, absolutely. And that line also makes me think of some of Poe's female protagonists or just, I'm trying to think of the right word, the female portrayal in his poetry with Annabel Lee and such, that it just, I can just see Annabel Lee walking by the kingdom by the sea. She walks in
Hmm.
beauty like the night.
Yeah, I mean it's the perfect. And even the women that dies in his works, there's always some sort of beauty. It may not be physical beauty, but there's always some sort of beauty about her that you feel sorry that she has suffered or that she has died. I mean, think of the wife and the black cat,
Yeah,
you know, and then you've got other things like in the premature burial, like
right.
Gia. Then you've got
Morella.
Morella, and then Berenice, and then
Hmm.
you know, even Berenice. Wait a minute, Berenice was the one with
Teeth.
yes, that's right. I was wanting to make sure I got it right. You know, Berenice was the one that was this description was so, tales of the crypt. But at,
Yes.
but at the same time, you had this feeling and this sorrow for her because you knew that she was suffering and that she shouldn't be, that there was a beauty in itself of her suffering.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think that's a lot where they cross over there also.
I think so too. It's that gothic just
Hmm.
romance, that you think of.
Yep. And
And
that's one of the ways that they are the oxymoron of each other.
yeah,
Whereas, Byron, he's building that angelic or the ethereal ideal of the
yes.
Grecian times,
Hmm.
whereas Poe is building that gothic, cryptic beauty.
Yeah.
So it's like heaven and hell.
Yeah, it really is. And if you look at it as an equal kind of, which is the opposite of that, it
Hmm.
definitely be the part of the poem that I read to Helen, the first Helen, that was Poe wrote to Jane Stannard when
Right.
after she died. He was a young boy and he had a huge crush on her. And he wrote that poem after her death. And that totally, to me, mixes together and marries into Byron's poem of the Hebrew melodies, that she walks in beauty like the night.
Exactly. And if I'm not mistaken, that line has shown up in quite a bit of songs over the years,
Yeah. We
especially in the 70s.
yeah, we probably should have looked that up. I'd
Yeah,
be curious.
I didn't even think about that until
Yeah,
just now. Good Lord.
it's all,
Because I was like, wait a minute. That was, I could see like CCR and some others that would use that in their, Three Dog Night, and
oh
some of those
yeah.
that would use that in their
Hmm.
lyrics.
Yeah, I,
Hold
I
on,
I
something's
totally
coming to my
agree.
brain.
Well, and so his marriage to Annabella was not necessarily a very happy one. They
Hmm.
he got them into quite a bit of debt. He was drinking heavily, and it pretty much drove Annabella, and they had a daughter together, away around January 15th, 1816. They left England in April, and he never saw them again.
Wow,
I thought that
that's
was
not
really
ominous.
very sad.
That is sad.
And I'm sorry, he left Geneva. I mean, he left England in April of 1816. That was my bad. I was reading the wrong thing. And he
Hmm.
went to Geneva. And then this is where the famous, I guess, party, get together, whatever you want to call it, writing session, the dare happened with Shelley, Mary Godwin at the time, and he was seeing a lady by the name of Claire Clareton. Like it was a weird name because it was like double first name with added at the end.
Yeah, that is odd.
And of course, that happened in 1818, but he stayed there for a while. And he found a new rhyme scheme in 1817 that was A B A B C C. And so he wrote a piece called Beppo, and he wanted to, it kind of gave him more passion about writing again. I think he went in cycles of, being involved with, his affairs and politics. He was also, in the House of Lords. So I think his writing was hit or miss sometimes, and he probably lost his passion for it here and there, and something new would revitalize his, mojo, whatever you want to call it.
And that would make sense. I mean, because we've talked about this before, how Poe got his inspirations from things that happened in his life.
Right,
You
right.
know,
They both
different
wrote what they
avenues.
knew. Yeah.
Yeah. And Byron especially made a point of saying that, I'm going to write what's happening to me, because he was very, like we talked about, he was very free, not only with his, love life, but with his writing and everything else. He was not one to hold back.
Yeah. And another quote, and this is about Don Juan. And so before I read this quote from him, because he got or found this new rhyme scheme for Beppo, that is the reason we have Don Juan today, is because of
Yep.
that. And this particular quote is talking about Don Juan. And he says, real life, either on my own or from people I knew. And that he's referring to what he writes about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, he's from straight from the man's mouth.
Yeah. I mean, he even wrote an ode to Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, talk about, writing something, because he was living it.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was just refreshing, I guess, to not only was he very, very uh good at what he did, but he could invoke such passion in the readers
Yeah,
with his words
absolutely.
that it was magical,
Yeah,
and still is in today. Because I mean, not and and this also boils down to everything else. We've talked about this with Poe too, is like not everybody's going to love everything that Poe wrote.
right.
Not everybody's going to love everything that Byron wrote. But there are some that will just stick with you and just grab you, because it's like reaching in and touching your soul.
Yes.
And I think that's why She Walks in Beauty has stood the test of time,
Yeah,
just like The Raven
I agree.
and Annabelle.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And he pretty much around 1819, he took his last mistress. Her name was Teresa Guccioli, and she pretty much was with him until the end. And this is the period where he pretty much wrote Don Juan, adding canto after canto. But there
Mm-hmm.
were three cantos that he never published, and they were supposed to be published after his death. Well, they were sold. I can't remember. I didn't write down the person who bought them. And instead, the person that bought them was trying to protect his reputation. And so he burned them. So
I
no one
know.
will ever know. And apparently they were very telling about his life. Like it was his like autobiographical, heavily, very heavily.
Well, I can see why they would do that because,
Yeah,
I mean, if take for instance, if Griswold had gotten hold of something like that for Poe,
he would have
he would
published
not
it.
have burned them. He would have published them,
Yeah,
and it
and
would have
kept
changed. I
them
think, yeah,
kept the money.
yeah. And he would have been okay with that. And he wouldn't have cared how it probably would have changed the whole perception of Poe and
Hmm.
even the reception of his works.
Yeah.
Whereas Byron, the person that got a hold of these scripts, protected that. Whereas Byron probably, and I'm just going to go off on a limb here, this is just
Yeah.
my own opinion,
Hmm.
he probably would have been able to survive whatever it was.
Yeah.
His reputation, even after he's gone, would have probably skyrocketed
Hmm.
because he was not the type of person to hide who he truly was
Right.
and
He
why.
really didn't
So,
care. Yeah.
exactly. So it's just irony that you have Griswold, who got a hold of Poe's works and was like his most hated rival,
Yes.
and
Making
published all
things
of
up
Poe's
about
works.
him. Right.
Yeah, and published all his works and made money off of him. And then you have on the other end Byron, who was so much of a free writer
Hmm.
that didn't care how anyone perceived him, and probably had a lot to do with him being of aristocratic nature.
Yeah.
Um, that they protected him after his death.
Yeah. It's that's a very ironic comparison.
Mhm. It is, and it's
It definitely is. Now, this is where I thought it was kind of interesting. So, in 1821, he joined an Austrian secret society called the Austrian Despotism.
hmm. I
And
thought you were going to say Illuminati, and I went, "What? No, sorry."
I just thought that was really interesting. And they were, or no, I'm sorry, it was an Austrian secret society. They were against Austrian despotism. And so they
Mm-hmm.
were fighting against that. But another one of his greatest works came out of this period towards the end of his life called The Vision of Judgment. And it was, I cannot remember who it was. I think it may have been Walter Scott, but I'll have to Google it. But another writer had written A Vision of Judgment, and he was kind of trying to trump that writer. I want to say, I may be getting this wrong, but trying to look real quick. It, oh, I cannot remember, but the author pretty much, I think it was Walter Scott, and I have to look this up, but basically, I think he turned to novels at that point because of this happening, if I'm right.
Okay.
I'm looking it up because, or no, it was Robert Southey.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it was a different writer who turned to novels after something else that Byron did.
Well, well, probably for good reason. He's like, nope, I'm not going to do that anymore.
Yeah, I didn't write. I wrote most of my notes down, but there's a few things that I didn't. And so his daughter Allegra, it was like Ada, I think, wasn't it Ada Allegra? Does that sound right?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Well, she went by Allegra. Uh, she came to live with him. He put her in a convent school around 1822, and she died at the age of 5 at the convent. She had an illness come up. Didn't say how she died. It could have been anything. And
Hmm.
then in the summer of 1823, he decided to join the military and fight for the Greek War of Independence from the Turks,
Yep.
which I thought was really interesting because, he would have been, what, 34, 35 at this time?
Let's see. You said 1823, right?
Hmm. Yeah, so he'd been 35.
So 23 and 12, 23 and 12, 35. He'd been 35. So a year before he died.
Yeah. And so, and again, he, kept writing again, just different time frames, different things happening in his life. January 22nd, 1824, he wrote one that I think a lot of people might have read in school. It was a 10 stanza poem. On this day, I complete my 36th year. And I think that's so creepy because he died that year.
He basically wrote his own eulogy,
Yeah,
which, that is ironic in itself. But
yeah. And his last poem that he published, or I'm sorry, it was published posthumously. It was named posthumously, called Love and Death.
yeah, now that sounds like that's a Poe thing right there.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And he pretty much, while he was fighting, he became ill and had a fever and rheumatic pains, and that's what took him down. And
Yeah.
he died from. But he was, Greece declared him a national hero. So that's amazing, because he did all that. And they,
Well, I mean, if he's not born a Greek and he
right.
actually goes and fights in a war against the Turks for the Greek nation, I think they should have,
That's pretty,
acknowledged him.
yeah, that's pretty amazing. I mean, because he spent a big chunk of his life in, this area. And,
Hmm.
but because pretty much when he left England for Geneva, he never returned alive back to England from that time
Right.
frame until he died because they brought his body back and he laid in state for 2 days and they buried him in July of 1824 in a family vault beneath the Channel Street Hucknall Torcard Church near the Newstead Abbey. So
Cool.
he still had enough credibility as a lord to lie in state for a few days for people to pay, their respects to him before they buried him.
Well, that's good. I
Yeah,
mean, even though, well, I mean, he made a name for himself all on
mhm,
his own with
absolutely.
his writing and not just because of his status as a baron. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that, talking about his military career and everything, one of the comparisons that I wanted to kind of talk about real quick was he published Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Canto 3 in 1818. And this is
mhm.
just one stanza from it. And I just want to kind of compare this to a stanza from Poe's Tamerlane, which Poe published in 1827. So here's the excerpt from Byron. There sunk the greatest, nor the worst of men, whose spirit antithetically mixed, one moment of the mightiest, and again on little objects with the like firmness fixed. Extreme in all things, hadst thou been betwixt, thy throne had still been thine, or never been. For daring made thy rises fall, thou seekest even now to reassume the imperial mine, and shake again the world, the thunderer of the scene. Guess that should have been mean. Sorry. I'm getting over a cold, so
That's okay. I
I
understand.
yes. So anyway, that's okay. All right, and then here's Tamerlane. I have not always been as now the fevered diadem on my brow. I claimed and won usurpingly. I, the same heritage hath given, Rome to the Caesar, this to me. the heirdom of a kingly mind and a proud spirit which hath striven triumphantly with humankind. And I just thought just how similar these are.
Yeah. They had definitely had
With that,
like minds when
yes,
it came to their writing and their interpretations, but they did have their own little unique ways of saying things.
right, right, exactly. And I just thought that was kind of a neat little thing to share. And there's other stanzas I think that might actually go together a little bit better. But when I was looking at both poems, those two kind of just spoke to me, I guess.
Yeah. Well, sometimes that's just the way it works.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's so many, I knew that Byron was a huge influence on Poe, and I didn't realize how similar they were. Just the things
Yeah.
that happened, uncontrollably in their life, not just the things that they maybe tried to do as people.
Yeah. I mean, it's just ironic if you look at, uh, if you go back and you look at the history of some of the famous writers and poets and, even playwrights, some of the most famous playwrights in history, some of them you can see the influence not only just between their writing, but in their realities.
Yeah,
And I think that's what makes them transcend time, in my opinion, is
yeah,
because it's not just the words they wrote on paper, but it was the life they lived that gave credence to those works of art.
mm-hmm, absolutely. And I was just kind of looking over my list of all I did Poe and Byron similarities, and I think we've talked about every single one of them. Uh, did we mention that they both had a swimming feat that they completed when they were younger? I don't, when they were,
No, we didn't mention that out loud on the episode. We had
yeah,
talked about it previous before
yes,
the
that's
episode
right.
started.
Yeah. And so
So,
it's really interesting, even down to those types of things, Byron also was into gymnastics. Poe was into
mhm.
boxing. They both had this, feat of a long swim, and it just so many things. It's unreal.
And this also could be attributed to the way they were raised and what
Yeah.
type of life they were living,
Yeah.
with the aristocratic of the English and then the aristocratic of the New America.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then one other thing that I found was some of the things that have been carried on with taking Byron's works and creating, adapted pieces with it. He he's basically a lot of his poetry has inspired different musical compositions by Berlioz, Schumann, Tchaikovsky,
Mhm.
operas, Donizetti, Verdi, paintings. And when you think about it, Poe has had the exact same thing happen. I mean, the Bells by Ravel, and there's another one. I'm trying to think. I can't think, but just that's just one to name one. And so it just it's it's eerie.
It is, but at the same time, it's like I said, when you have things that transcend time, that their influence will have to expand
Yeah,
because of the changing of society.
yeah,
I mean, think
absolutely.
of all the different we've talked about in pop culture. How many artists have done songs with Poe about Annabelle Lee? We got
Absolutely.
Stevie Nicks. Then we have the Alan, what's it called? Alan Parsons Project.
Hmm.
They've got all different kinds. And we have, was it Metallica?
Iron Maiden had one
Yeah,
for
Iron Maiden.
Version the
That's right. It
Room
was.
Org. Yeah. Well, yeah, it
Yeah.
just, yeah.
So
And
I
then
think even
all the,
Black Sabbath did a poem as a song.
it is so
Um,
many. I mean, songs, pop culture references, and TV shows. I mean,
mhm.
I'm a book that I'm reading right now, or no, it's one I just finished, had a little Poe reference in there. And
Yeah, I mean,
it was
even
like, and I was not expected whatsoever. I was just like, oh, here's a little cool little nugget.
well, and that other thing is that you can find these little nuggets in anything. Because I
Yeah,
was reading just one of my fictional books that I kind of just like to read for an escapism
yeah,
and stuff, and there was references to Poe in that, and I'm going, wow,
yeah,
okay, so it's across genre, it's
yep,
across generation. Things like this, they always just keep going. It's like the
yeah.
Energizer Bunny. It just keeps going.
Oh yeah.
Something gives it power and it just won't, doesn't go. And I think with Byron and with Poe, their works will continue
I
no
I
matter what.
I agree. And I don't know if I mentioned it or not. Like the ideal person that inspired Byron was Alexander Pope. And it would be
Yep, we
really,
hadn't mentioned that.
yeah, it would be really interesting to look at him and just see, okay, are there some similarities as well? But yeah,
Not as much as there is between Byron and Poe.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I've studied Pope a little bit, but not a lot. I mean,
yeah.
to me, he's an acquired taste, but
Yeah, I remember learning a little bit about him. I don't recall anything off the top of my head. And so, but just
no, he was a genius, just like the rest of them in his
yeah.
writing, but he was not as prolific
Hmm.
of a, as some of the other ones. And I don't mean that as he didn't write a lot. I'm just saying that he wasn't as received as well, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. And the
That's just my opinion for anybody that's Alexander Pope fans. I'm sorry.
well, it, there is something for everyone. And so,
Exactly.
not everybody is going to like the same thing. You will, and that's okay.
Exactly.
That's why the world goes round and around and
Exactly.
around.
And it
And
keeps going
the one
and going and
thing,
going.
the one thing I think that where they definitely differ is that Byron's works, except for the censorship, here and there, they were very well received, sold lots of copies while he was alive, and
Mhm.
Poe did not see that same hype during his time. It's been
Yeah.
more after his death.
And once more, I think this attributes to not only their place where they were living and where they grew up,
Yeah,
but also Poe did not stay within that aristocratic world because he
right.
was not received. I think if he had, done as Alan wanted him to and became a, a business, I guess,
Mhm.
person,
Yeah, worked in
he could
his
have had
line
a
of
lot
work,
of, yeah, he could have had a lot of success.
but
But
he
I think it would,
would he have been the writer that he came to be?
no, that's what I'm saying. He would have had a lot of success because he would have had Alan's backing,
Yeah,
but he would not be the writer that we probably know and love today.
exactly. Yeah,
So that has a lot to do with the people and the influence that stayed in their lives and they had. So
yeah, yeah. Oh,
yeah, Poe Poe,
oh, oh.
poor Poe,
On
poor
that
Poe.
on that note,
We are
Poe
Poe
out.
She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies.